Hey guys, Matthew here. In this video I'm going to talk to you about the Grasshopper interface, and it's going to be pretty much a kind of a knowledge dump in order to just give you some pretty basic understanding about how the interface works, and not go into specifics on anything quite purposely, just to get you guys a little bit more comfortable with how the interface kind of works. So firstly, you'll notice that when you open Grasshopper, which you do by typing Grasshopper into the Rhino command line, it is that easy, that you will get this kind of rectangular grid window that you can scroll in and out of, and then hold down Control with your right mouse button to also kind of zoom in and out, and then Shift with your right mouse button to pan. And you'll notice that mine's a bit cut off with my little Rhino icon, so let me just move that quickly for you, just so you can see it. Just trying to, let me just, 1 second, sorry. I made it a little bit too good. You can only see just a little bit of it right there. Like, you should be able to see my mouse. You should have this circle with a black arrow, and that black arrow is pointing at this corner here, which, for the sake of simplicity, let us call it right now the origin. And if my camera view is flipped so I can't see those two black lines, it will point towards it. So if you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, you can follow the compass arrow to the origin. So it makes a lot of sense to start working in this zone here. In my weird pure kind of ways, I like just working in this bottom quadrant here only, and never touching this. It's just an obsessive compulsive thing for me. It doesn't really matter. Now, I'm going to firstly talk about these things here. So we've got File, Edit, View, Display. That's in every piece of Windows software. But we also have these categories: params, maths, sets, vector, curve, surface, mesh, intersect, transform, display. And we also have these subcategories in each of the categories: geometry, primitive, input, utility. And you'll notice that only some of the icons are up here, and there's a whole bunch of them down the bottom. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there's more than 7 in the actual menu. Here we have, same case for geometry, same case for primitive, same case for input. So these are commonly used components here, and the more uncommonly used components are hidden away in the menu itself. So let's kind of consider how we might bring in a point into Grasshopper. So I'm going to go over to my Rhino window, and I'm going to make a point, and I'm going to click, and I'm going to put it in the file. So we should be able to see a point. I select it, and it's nice and yellow, and I want to bring that into Grasshopper. So the way that you do that is that you go to this geometry tab, and this geometry subcategory has all the components that you would use to bring Rhino geometry into Grasshopper. I'm just going to click on the point component because we want to bring in a point, and it'll come in. And you'll notice that it comes in a particular way, that it comes in as orange. Now, before we move forward, I want to highlight that your Rhino might look like this, where it has it written as letters, which is totally fine. And that's how I work, and I religiously work that way. And some people prefer to have the draw icons option on, as shown here. I particularly don't care which one you choose, whatever works best for you. But I've installed this plugin called Bifocals, which when I click and drop it into the scene, it will give a text description above the component, and it'll also maintain the picture icon. So whatever way you want to work, this will help you work that way. So that's what this component you might see in my files is. Then I'm just going to sit there and move all the way to the origin so I don't have to really worry about it again. So, okay, Grasshopper components have 3 colors. White, grey, there's grey, white, grey, then the next colour is orange, which we currently see here, and then the final colour is red. Red means you have really stuffed up. There is a computational error that has occurred, and you're not going to get a response out. Orange is you might have stuffed up. I have some warnings. And then silver and white is everything is great, everything is hunky-dory, keep going. So our point component currently is orange, so it's saying there might be a problem. So to check that warning, I can right-click on the component, and I get a drop-down menu, and I can choose Runtime Warnings, and it'll say Floating Parameter PT failed to collect data point. So it's telling me that it hasn't got any point data to begin working with. So if I right-click on it and go further down, you'll see there's set one point and set multiple points. I've only got 1 point at the moment, so I'm going to choose set 1 point. And you'll notice in Rhino you have some options about how to bring in point data. I personally prefer it to be set to object, so I'm just going to select the object to reference. And voila, we have a point. Now, I want to prove to you that there's a point in there in some sense. So I've got a point component, it's gone white, so it doesn't have any errors or warnings or messages of any sort, which is great. And I want to get it to somehow print information for me so I can get an understanding that the point is actually there. So in the params tab still, sorry, the params category, I'm going to go to the input menu and I'm going to choose a panel. What a panel does is a bunch of stuff. I'll probably make a whole video on panels alone. I'm just going to drag the right circle here into the left circle there. And what's that is doing is this, anything that comes into here is an input, and anything that comes out on the right side is an output. So we've collected data directly from Rhino in this component, so it has no inputs. The input is being given through the component itself, but it has an output, and it's outputting this referenced point that I can just line up with my OCD Snapping Gecko component that I've also got in as a plugin. Now, okay, we've got a reference point. So it could be anything, like I move the point in Rhino and it doesn't tell me anything about the point. So I'm going to go quickly to vector, and I'm going to choose to go to the point subcategory, and I'm going to choose to deconstruct the point. Now you'll notice that it's orange, and it is orange because it's failed to collect data. And that is because it hasn't been given a point. So if I click on this point here and click over to the deconstruct, you will notice that it allows me to plug it in there, and now it's white and everything is as it should be. Now, this point is currently on the z-axis, so I'm going to plug the x component of that point into the panel, and it's telling me that its x component is currently 18.568174. So what we would expect is if I move this point on the x-axis, that number would change. And the same is true of the y and the z. If I move the point in the y and not the z, and not the x, it'll change that. And if I move it in both, it'll change both. So as you can see, I have a point that's getting its input from Rhino itself, so it doesn't have an input. I've got a deconstruct point component, which is getting its input from the point component, thus that particular line. And then we've got these two panels that are getting their input from the x and the y coordinates of that point and printing them to the screen. That is really, really useful. Now, an important thing to realize is that if I want to delete a line, for example, say I accidentally plugged this into the y and I actually wanted to plug it into the z, there's a couple of ways you can go about it. So if I click on the z and put it in there instead, it will replace the line. If I hold the control key down and click on the node, either the input or the output, doesn't matter, and reconnect it, it will remove the connection. If I hold down Shift while doing this, I can get both the Y and the Z in the same panel fairly easily. So just to go over that again, so it's really, really clear, and I will remove this one as well. Okay, so to connect, you go from one of these semicircles to the other, and it doesn't matter which one you do first. You can go output to input, input to output. If you want to add multiple threads, you can hold down Shift, and it will let you add multiple. If you want to remove a thread, you hold down the Control key, and it'll let you remove the input that you're dealing with. Pretty simple, but really useful, because sometimes you find you might have connected the wrong thing, and you might want to delete the wrong one. Blah 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 blah. Another thing you can do is you can right-click over the component and choose to disconnect it from something. So panels don't really have it, which is really irritating, but say I want to disconnect this deconstruct from the point component. I can right-click on the P, go disconnect, and I can get rid of that pretty quickly. Pretty quick. So I just undid that, which is all fine. Now to move on, I'm going to now create a new piece of code where I make a point component like we did before, and instead of choosing this set one point, I'm going to choose set multiple points. So clearly what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to input multiple points into Grasshopper. So what I'm going to do is in Rhino, I'm going to draw a bunch of points, not really caring too much about them. And I'm going to right click on my orange component, and I'm going to select set multiple points. Now I've got this one component here which has 1 point in it, and when I click on it it's green. When I don't have it clicked it's red, and vice versa. It's green when those are selected and red when they're not. And I'm going to click and select these guys. I'm going to click and put these guys into the deconstruct component, and you'll notice a couple of things. Firstly, for every point I'm getting every X location and Y location of those points, and if I click on one to move it around in Rhino, you'll notice that that is only affecting one of these numbers in both these lists. I'll do that again with the entire panels visible. The next thing you will notice, and probably more importantly, is that instead of having the single line, which you see here, these are a double line. And what a double line means is that I have a bunch of stuff coming out of there. I don't just have one thing, I have 5, 10, 23 things. That could be anything. I don't really know what they are all the time. Like, it could be a bunch of curves and points. It could be a bunch of cubes and curves and points. It could be just points, it could be just curves, it could be just cubes. It doesn't matter. It's not looking at that. It's just saying, okay, this is a list of things. And we'll talk about lists in a lot of detail later. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on this graph option here. I'm not going to explain what it does to you, but you'll notice that there's a third type of connection type, which is, wire display type, which is effectively, instead of just being a list of things, the way I usually think about it, which is not kind of always the best way to think about it, is that it is not a list of things, but a list of lists specifically. So that's the third type, and we'll get into that a bit later. So I'm going to turn the graph off by just clicking there. Another thing you might find useful, which I use extraordinarily rarely, I use it really just when I need to clean things up a bit, is that there is an option about wire displays. And there's faint, which means that it's quite light, and there's also another one which is called hidden, which gets this little like Wi-Fi logo on the side of the component. And what that means is I can't actually see a line between the component and what it's connected to. But if I click on the component, it'll draw the line for me. or if I click on a component that's connected to it, it'll also draw the line for me. I use that very rarely, but so you have a tangled mess of things attached to each other, and when you click on a component, you want it to be really, really clear what it's connected to. That's actually quite useful to do then. So I'm going to put that back on default. Cool. And what I want to do is I'm going to disconnect my multiple curves because I'm not interested in what I was doing over there anymore. So I'm going to go down here. I'm going to have a new little narrative starting, a new bit of code. And I'm going to draw a polyline that connects all of these points. So to create a polyline, I'm going to go to curve because a polyline is a type of curve. I'm going to go to spline and I'm going to choose polyline. Now, if you ever get to this point and you know it's got a little V there and it's asking for something, it's asking for polyline vertex points. Now, and you know, I plug it in and it'll connect it. Now, you'll notice that the icon of what the component's asking for, polyline vertex points, is the same as the box that is giving it to it. And you'll notice that the output of the point component. Now, when I go over to the deconstruct, you'll notice that there's a very different icon. I'm like, it's still a hexagon, but instead it's got the number 0.1 there. That is not a point, right? That is a number. And it's got an icon that represents it as such. So here, I've got a hexagon with a point on it going into a component that's asking for a point component. If I go down to the C, here is something that's asking for something different again, and it's asking for a different type of variable, but it's not a point. So if I unplug that and I plug the points into the C, you'll notice that, you know, I don't get a polyline out, right? Because it's not asking for points. But if I put it into the thing that is asking for points, I get a polyline out. Cannot make it much more simpler than that. Now, if you have by chance double-clicked, and this is something that I don't really suggest kind of new users do, but people kind of get obsessed with searching for commands pretty quickly, because looking around and discovering what's there is really, really important. Now, I've currently got this enter a search keyword right now, and say I want to get the polyline component up. Got to spell it correctly first. And there we go, and I can click on that, and it'll give me a copy of that component, right? So if you get a bit, you know, you're not entirely sure where a component might be, you can double click and you can say, you know, I think it might be called line. Okay, so there's a series of line options, and then I can read what each one does, and I can choose the line option that's best for me. So if you're struggling to find a component, that's a way you might find it. And a good way, if you want to make a copy of a component, is that if you hold down the Alt key after you've selected the object, it'll make you a copy that's connected to everything. So when I just copy an object, it also does that as well, which is pretty useful. You know, you just have to come through and disconnect stuff from one component, which is pretty cool. But Alt is a much quicker way than just doing a clipboard copy and paste. Now, if I hold down Alt before I start doing that, you'll notice that I'm moving massive parts of the canvas to the left or to the right. That's really useful if you're trying to actually, you know, you realize that there has to be 10 components between here and here. So you might hold down Alt and move all that stuff over to give you the space to put those components that you are looking at into. Awesome. Okay, cool. So now we have a polyline. And now we can do a few things, like I can show you a few things just to make things a little bit more kind of evident what's going on here. Now, if I right click on this, it's got preview, enabled, and bake. I'm going to choose bake. I'm going to click on it, and you'll notice that we get a window up here, and it's got a whole series of options which are kind of fairly obvious. I'm not going to go into them in much detail. I'm just going to click OK. And if I click where that line is, sorry, that polyline is, I make a copy of it, right? I bake it into the Rhino file. If I try and select it at the moment, there's nothing to select because it's not there. It's only in Grasshopper. So if I move a point, you know, it automatically updates. Let me just close my C-planes option. Sorry about that. It just moves a point around pretty obviously. But what's kind of really cool is it doesn't leave behind a copy. It's never actually adding anything to Rhino. The only time you want to add stuff to Rhino is when you're ready to put it into Rhino, do drawings, and get it out again. Pretty powerful software. Pretty useful. Now, you might also want to not be able to see an object. So if I right click on my object, I can turn its preview off, and you'll notice that it goes a grey colour, not a white colour, like it's a dark silver instead of a light silver. Very similar to this bifocals component. It doesn't actually have anything to display, so its display is off by default. All it does is bring up these little words here on top of components. Now, that's cool. That's really useful. So if I had like 1,000,001 components and they all had their display on, it'd be really, really difficult to see what each one is doing. So it's kind of quite useful to be able to turn a bunch off. And if you select 2 components, you can right click on the canvas in general and you can turn the preview off all those objects. Now, if I, sorry, I just stuffed that up completely. If I, this last option, which is enable disable, if I click on that, you'll notice that it kind of grays itself out completely. Even the icon is grayed out. And that is, it's turned off. It's not computing at all anymore. Sometimes you might want to turn stuff off if you're having some computational problems with it. It's kind of one strategy for debugging. So when you find the breakpoint, you just disable everything after it, so you're just dealing with the thing in question. Maybe I'll make a video about debugging in the future if people want it. I'm not entirely sure if that is something that you guys might find interesting or useful. But disabling turns it off. It's not computing at all. So if I enable this, and then I disable the point component, which is getting the input from Rhino, it'll turn orange because now it's not, and even the line turns orange because now it's not getting any information. So that's pretty cool. So now I'm going to make this some 3D geometry so I can describe some of the stuff up here in this just below the ribbon. So I'm going to extrude this polyline. So I'm going to go to surface, I'm going to go to freeform, and I'm going to choose extrude. Now if I go too fast, or you want to know where a component is that's in a file that you're currently looking at, you can hold down Control Shift and it will show you exactly where that component is in the Rhino components categories and subcategories, which is pretty useful. So it asks for a profile, curve or surface, and I have a polyline which is a profile curve, so I'm going to drag that into the B, and you'll notice that this icon is very different to this icon. Well, not very different, it's slightly different. And when we click on it, you'll notice that it is the same icon as the geometry component, which the geometry component is used to be a little bit more general. I mean, like, it can hold points and lines, it can hold points and curves, it can hold points and surfaces, it can hold meshes and points, it can hold anything. Any set of geometry that you want, it can hold. And it's quite useful. So because I can extrude either a curve or a surface, it is asking for curves or surfaces, and it's showing me this icon instead of the curve icon. But a curve is what it's after. The next thing it's after is an extrusion direction. And I'm just going to quickly go to vector, and I'm just going to choose to extrude this in the unit Z direction. So I'm just going to move to extrude it up in Rhino. And now it goes from orange to silver, and I can do a little bit of OCD lining my stuff up the way I like it. And you'll notice that I now have a piece of geometry. So now we can talk about this stuff here. So by default, we have draw shaded preview geometry set to on. The one to the left of it is draw wireframe preview geometry, which, you guessed it, will draw the geometry as a wireframe. And the final one is don't draw anything. I'm not entirely sure when you would ever use that, because if you're dealing with like problems that don't have a geometric base, I'm not sure why you're using Grasshopper necessarily, but it might have uses, and people might find uses for it that I'm just not strictly aware of right now. But then again, I do most of my work in Python, so I don't use a lot of Grasshopper. My Grasshopper code is usually just a Python component and then like a whole bunch of work in that. All good. So there are your three choices there. Shaded, wireframe, nothing at all. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Like Ned Flanders. The next one is only draw preview geometry. So if I click on a component, it'll just draw that component and nothing else. Pretty cool, huh? So this is really useful for finding where a bugging problem comes in. So say I've got this code here, right? And all I really care about is this final surface that's coming out, right? I don't really need to see this polyline being printed. So I might turn its display off, right? So usually, so I'm just seeing this extruded object, right? And I figure out that there's a problem. And clearly there's not a problem because, the code is so simple. But say it's like, this long, there might be something that I did further down the program that has had some pretty drastic influences in where I am, and I realized I have to figure out what happened there. So this is great because, I'm just seeing the final thing that I'm working with in a lot more clarity, and it's not getting confused with all this stuff. But then when I want to click on this, I can go back and I can click on previous components and understand how that problem might have happened, which is really, really useful. So I use that one a lot. Now the last option is here. Well, the second last option is you can actually change your display mode in Grasshopper. So if you don't like the colors red and green, feel free to move these sliders around or choose some of these options in order to make your Grasshopper look the way you want it to look. But it'll only do it for this file. I'll show you how to change it in the overall settings in a second. I'm going to leave it where it is because I don't want to have a different interface to you guys because that will just become confusing. All right, and then the last one is some meshing settings, which is about how well your preview geometry is doing. And sometimes you might have to set it to high or custom, but for the most part, low is useful because it allows you to be what's most important, fast. It allows the computation to happen very, very quickly. Now, that's all good. Awesome. So I'm going to just show you a few quick other things, and then we'll just do a quick recap, and that'll be the end of the video. So under File, I'm going to quickly just go to Preferences. And you'll notice that there's a series of preferences here, and I think it starts off on the Interface tab, I think. Clearly I was having a play around. You have a whole series of options here. Now, do whatever you want. Like, have a look through it. There's a content filter that goes from none to anything, which is kind of quite an odd filter to have, but whatever you want it on, that's fine. You can set up some preview stuff about your kind of personality, like who your author is, what email people should contact you with, blah, 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 blah. Some information about fonts, interface, palette of the components. You can change what components look like. I'm not going to because, again, it'll be confusing. This is where you can change the default template materials. So if you're a big fan of blue and purple, you can make everything blue and purple. Some files options and some options about the solver and loading components, which we might get into in a bit. Now, the next thing is that we have special folders, components folder. And in that, I have bifocals and snapping gecko. So bifocals was the thing that gave me the names, and snapping gecko is the thing that lets me have my OCD dealt with very effectively. Very useful components. So if you download a custom piece of componentry. That's really, really useful to look into there. And then the next one that's really useful is the use objects folder, which I currently don't have anything in, which allows you to store custom code that you've written and bring it into other projects. So that's pretty much everything for an introduction to kind of the Grasshopper interface, which is a bit of a mouthful, but let's just quickly go through everything we kind of did. So we've explored how to open the window, how to bring geometry, just points mind you, but geometry into Grasshopper. We've also looked at how we can get that information and query things about it using a deconstruct component and then some panels to print to screen. We've also looked at how we can create geometry from geometry and geometry from that geometry. We've also looked at how to connect, disconnect wires. We've also looked at preview, baking, and enabled functions. We've also looked at changing the shading functions, you know, how things can be blue, purple, pink, red, and we've also gone through kind of a quick list of where the preferences are and where you would install components and store your user objects, which, you know, we might do a video on user objects in detail later. Oh, wow. Okay, so that is a mouthful. That's it for this video. That was a pretty big download. I apologize if it got a bit boring, but that's it. And that should be everything we need in detail about the generality of Grasshopper to actually move forward. That's all good. I'll see you in the next video.